There's a wisdom that moves beneath the surface of things, and a power that intervenes beyond the limits of karma. It does not follow our desires, our merit, or our understanding, but it is always at work. And welcome to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast, once again with your hosts Bernhard and Laura Matsu. So in this podcast, we are going to explore the topics of divine grace and divine guidance, which are both aspects of divine will that operate in our lives and in the world, but most often unseen but never absent. So this is not about any religious dogma or spiritual wishful thinking, definitely not about any New Age concept of you create your own reality. It's about the actual forces behind transformation, the divine intelligence that guides our evolution, and the light that breaks through when all seems lost. That's really the essence of the grace. So we will explore what these forces are, how they function, and what it means to truly live in alignment with something higher than what our ego personality perceives. So in this first part, again, as listeners of our podcast know, we always have two parts. The second part is available for our members. You can sign up there at veilofreality.com. Now, in this first part, we immerse ourselves in the divine grace, a force that moves outside of natural law, merit, morality, or karma. Now, grace cannot be summoned, it cannot be manifested, it can't even be earned. It's not a reward for good deeds. It actually arrives when the soul is ready or when a deeper intervention is required from the perspective of divine will. Sometimes it erupts without warning. Other times it follows long periods of darkness, suffering, or also sincere aspiration. We'll also share powerful real-life examples of redemptive grace from our own lives and also from saints and mystics throughout history, showing how grace can arrive as a sudden light, a fierce destruction, or even just gentle support. In the second part of this podcast, we turn towards divine guidance. That's more a quiet, ongoing current that moves through our lives, shaping the path from within. Now, unlike grace, which often comes like lightning, guidance unfolds through the rhythms of daily life, through synchronicities, inner nudges, also challenges, breakdowns, breakthroughs, and strange timings and encounters that don't make sense until later. Just as divine guidance shapes the individual or our individual lives, it also moves through the world at large. So, especially in these times we're in right now, what appears as chaos or intensifying polarization or darkness on the surface may conceal a deeper evolutionary movement beneath it that is necessary for transformation. So in that second part, we'll show you how to recognize this guidance, how to attune to it more deeply, and how it works to lead you towards a greater alignment with truth and also fulfilling your unique purpose in this time and age. This also includes practical ways of listening, obviously, inner stillness, sincerity, and surrender. We'll talk all about that. We'll also explore how guidance, this divine guidance and divine grace interact, kind of the similarities or also differences, obviously, how one prepares the ground for the other, and how both move from the same divine source in alignment with divine will. It's really about cultivating the inner conditions through which guidance can move more clearly so we can recognize it better in our daily lives. That's really what it's about, especially nowadays. It really aligns with tuning into our inner guidance with all that. Now, before we dive in, a quick announcement. A few weeks ago, I hosted a live masterclass titled Spiritual Warfare in the Time of Transition, What Every Spiritual Warrior Needs to Know Right Now. This class lays out the core mechanics of spiritual warfare, how it operates through you and around you. It maps the psycho-spiritual work required to confront darkness, reclaim your power, and navigate this time of transition with discernment, courage, and alignment with the divine. So if you have missed that live event, the full 2-hour and 45-minute recording is now available at riseofthespiritualwarrior.com. It's packed with relevant insights, practical tools, and includes a Q&A segment with the live audience. You will also get a PDF file of the slides to follow along. So again, if you want to get the recording and replay, head over to the website riseofthespiritualwarrior.com.
Okay, so we're going to begin with defining what is divine grace. So divine grace is an act of the divine, is an act of God that intervenes in our life, sometimes suddenly, sometimes less dramatically. And the main thing with divine grace is that it tends to act beyond the limitations of karma, even our ideas of karma. We have to realize that we have an idea of what our karma is and like what we've earned and what we haven't. It acts completely beyond that. It acts beyond our mental ideas of what is right, what is wrong. You know, we tend to also have judgments about morality that we've picked up from different spiritual or religious traditions. Divine grace acts beyond our own moral ideas and our human ideas of what is right or wrong. And most importantly, it acts beyond how much we think we've earned it. So whether we've done like all of the right things, been of service, been loving, whatever our ideas of being a good person are, it acts completely beyond that. And so it tends to also transform us, sometimes suddenly, sometimes more gently over time. You can't predict it. You can't manifest it. And it really just acts from God's own vision, and it has a deeper purpose. And that deeper purpose is often hidden to us, hidden to our ordinary consciousness, because we're not all-knowing like God is. Yet the experience will often bring us towards a deeper awakening, a deeper relationship with life, with God, with ourselves, with other people. So it tends to help us heal in some way, or it just helps us spiritually make progress, basically. And I'm going to read a quote from Edgar Cayce, which I really like. And he says, quote, "The law of grace supersedes the law of karma. If at one point we realize that we have done wrong and have truly learned our lesson, we may find ourselves dealing with the intervention of grace. This is when we can dodge the corrective action of karma because we have come to realize that what we have done is wrong and we go to work fixing this. However, grace is not an excuse to avoid our responsibilities and make up for them later. It only comes to us when we have truly gained understanding and we can move to use that understanding in our lives. Awareness of grace can come to us when we are facing a difficult situation and we call out for help. At that moment, it may feel as if someone has lifted an enormous weight off our shoulders, or we feel as if everything is going to be all right. It can come to us at a time when we feel down and suddenly we find the strength to continue, or in a moment of inspiration. Opening ourselves to grace can make our paths easier to travel. So the law of grace is not an excuse to not like engage in your own spiritual work and your inner work, but to understand that it tends to almost cancel out karmic conditions is basically what he's saying. And as I'll share later, that's what I experienced in my own experience of this. So at the basic level, divine grace is not a product of logic, of cause and effect. It's not the result of us being good or our idea of being good or doing the right things or following even a specific moral code, which all of the religions hand down to us, by the way, is like, even if we're not even particularly religious, we tend to formulate our own ideas of right or wrong based on our own either conscious or ideas of morality and right or wrong. Divine grace is also not a reward for good deeds. That's karma, actually. You can't summon it. You can't create it. You can't demand it will happen. You can't manifest it. And the most interesting thing about divine grace is it tends to contradict this idea, this karmic law of reward and punishment. So it can, Adyashanti has this famous story. I think he talks about it in Healing the Core Wound of Unworthiness, where he saw a murderer who was in solitary confinement come to one of his talks, and he could just tell by his being that he had been hit by divine grace. And this guy was, someone who, from most people's standpoints had done bad things in the world, but even within that, he had been hit by the divine grace. So it doesn't act in accordance with karmic law, and it actually tends to, I would argue, even it overrides it. And it also doesn't follow our human ideas of justice, fairness, morality. And when the grace arrives, it can arrive suddenly, like a lightning bolt sometimes, or it can be slowly, more subtle. It can happen in more less dramatic moments after years of preparation. We can't demand that it's going to happen. We can't will it to happen. In fact, I think that's actually going to contradict it even happening. We can't even claim that we created it. That's like the ego trying to hijack the experience, which I think the thing with, powerful spiritual experiences, as I've noticed, as many other people have noticed who are sincere in their path, is that the moment you have a spiritual experience, the ego wants to take ownership of it and say, oh, I created that, or I'm special. It's like almost an automatic reflex where the I that we think we are tries to identify with things. Nor can you predict it. So you can't look in your astrology chart, even though I've noticed certain correlations with transits. And it often appears when we least expect it. But you can invite it through developing a quality of openness, receptivity to receive it, and most of all, having real sincerity on our spiritual path, to work on ourselves, to remember God, all of these qualities of sincerity where we're trying to do things for the sake of God and we're not doing things for the sake of reward or to create a new spiritual persona. Everything we do on our spiritual path needs to be in a sincere desire to know God, to see the truth, rather than to create a new spiritual persona or, create some sort of merit. And I think that's where the sincerity comes from. It comes from a sense of humility and humbleness. So the divine grace often works behind the scenes, and it can strike us at any moment. And when it manifests, our ego mind may find it to be irrational or not make a lot of sense. And its action often will contradict what our mind thinks it earns. And I think this is really important, is that even though it can hit anyone out of nowhere, regardless of how much you've meditated or prayed or did whatever spiritual practice, it often will follow some years of unseen preparation. Not always, but often, mainly because that will clear the way. Because if you're kind of hardened in your own body armor, you have a lot of suppressed pain, a lot of suppressed wounds, this force of divine grace almost can't even penetrate into your being because you have so much blocking it. So I think, an aspect of this is almost like working on those blockages so you can clear the way to receive it. But not always. I've seen it hit people who were also, seemed a little bit hardened too. And then most of all, it doesn't favor you if you think you're righteous, a good person, if you're following all your religion's codes of what is right or wrong. And I think that's the most radical aspect of divine grace. It doesn't follow these laws of what we believe is right and wrong according to the ideas of morality we've picked up from various spiritual teachings. So divine grace can descend on a criminal, a murderer, as I shared with Adyashanti's experience. It can descend on someone who's just a lost soul. It could actually ignore the spiritual devotee or the righteous religious person. I think even especially, when we're talking about righteousness, it easily slips into self-righteousness. I'm a good person because I read the Bible every day, or I'm a good person because I follow these precepts. I don't eat meat. Whatever your religion prescribes to you, you can easily, the ego tends to hijack that and then become self-righteous and prideful, which I think is a huge, it's natural for the ego to want to take ownership of things, but I think it blocks us being able to receive these higher forces. And so basically it doesn't respond to us based on our outer merit or our ideas of morality, but can respond in accordance to an inner readiness.
Yeah, Sri Aurobindo talked a lot about the divine grace and the difference to divine guidance or divine will or the cosmic law. And speaking of the self-righteousness, he also talked about that the grace can cure the self-righteous the self-righteous of the self-righteousness, especially in the religious person, right? Which is easily, the ego can hijack it and you become very self-righteous in your quote-unquote spiritual practice and so forth. But a very important aspect of the divine grace to understand, which Sri Aurobindo also emphasizes, that it transcends cosmic law. It also transcends what is known as natural law. That has become very popular, right? But it goes way beyond it. It is, again, not bound by the laws of karma, no reason, no morality. There's no intellectual logic behind it. The mind will not understand it. It literally contradicts the law of the world. It acts outside any deterministic rules of nature and evolution. So Sri Aurobindo outlined 3 spiritual forces. The cosmic law, which is karmic consequences, law of cause and effect, natural law, cosmic justice, so to speak. Then there's divine compassion, which tries to help human beings with the constraints of the law, right? Works within the cosmic law or natural law, even within karma and all of that, but guides through it via the compassion. And standing outside of it, there's a divine grace. Number 3, acts freely, directly, and with irresistible power. Is the most powerful force out of those 3. It's the highest, most transformative force, but also the rarest and most mysterious. Now, all 3 of these forces, cosmic law, which is karma, divine compassion, and divine grace, are modes of divine will. So all of the 3 are part of divine will, functioning at different levels. So, for example, divine will assists the soul, but without overriding karmic consequences, right? It helps through the karmic lessons, through the divine compassion, some assistance, some support, but we still need to learn our lessons, work out our karma. But divine grace can hit at any time and nullify and override karma at any point in somebody's journey, no matter if they're quote-unquote good or quote-unquote bad person from our ego mindset of good or bad. So it overrides it all. It can instantly transform, uplift, or deliver even the most fallen soul. I think this will be very hard for us, for a human, to understand this. Even the most darkest psychopathic murderer could experience, and has experienced, as many examples, divine grace. So grace is divine will as a miracle and mercy, acting in perfect time, but the timing is based on the eyes of the divine, the omniscience of the divine, and has nothing to do with our very limited human mental understanding of what we think grace is. So with that being said, let's look at some of examples of how the divine grace has manifested in our personal lives and throughout history.
Okay, so I'm going to share an experience that happened with me in India, and then I'll talk about an experience that happened with Adyashanti, which was very affirming because the way that he described it also kind of confirms what I experienced. So it happened in 2018, shortly before I met Bernhard, and I went to India quite literally seeking enlightenment. So I was very deep in my spiritual practice. I was meditating for 2 hours a day, doing yoga, sometimes for hours a day. And I was having a lot of profound experiences. I felt very uplifted. You know, sometimes it felt very destabilizing. I was definitely a little bit ungrounded. But basically, it all kind of took off after I had a profound experience at a Vipassana retreat where my interest in meditation deepened. So after that retreat, I experienced a shift in consciousness when I was living at an intentional community at the time. And I remember watching the snow falling on the ground and just entering the state of presence. And it felt like, as I describe it, a party was in my head with a bunch of people talking, and they all left. Because like many of you, my mind was often like not only just one inner narrator, but multiple voices in my head who were all having conversations, but they suddenly just became quiet on that day. And my mind never went back to where it was before since then. And then I learned later that what I experienced with this sudden quieting the mind is what was called scientifically, this aspect of the brain is called the default mode network. So this is the center of ego, identity. It's where our inner narrator takes place, where a sense of me comes from. So essentially from that retreat, something in my default mode network decreased greatly that day. And I just experienced more present moment awareness. So from that moment on, I also became very obsessed with my own spiritual growth. It almost like it reached another level. And then I decided I was going to go to India, to go to Rishikesh, which is a spiritual hotspot in northern India near the Himalayas. So when I arrived at Rishikesh, I spent a lot of my time at a hostel that was near an ashram that I was visiting there. So at first I was just attending satsangs, which is just like a kind of like talks with sometimes music and kirtan at an ashram called Sakshadam. I was seeing this guru talk who's actually speaks in mainly Portuguese. His name is Prem Baba. And so I was at the ashram of his own guru and his own lineage, which is called Sakshadam. And for the remainder of the period, I was just meditating in the room of his guru, which is said to maintain his consciousness and energy still. So I would meditate 1 hour there in like the late afternoon or morning, and then 1 hour in the evening. And, nothing much seemed to be happening. I honestly wasn't expecting anything to happen. I think that can actually get in the way sometimes of us having spiritual experience. If we're like, oh, I'm meditating, some spiritual experience is going to happen. It never happens when you think it's going to happen. So I just did it day in and day out because it was a really nice spot to meditate. There wasn't a lot of people there too, which was really nice. And then one day that kind of all changed. So in India, I didn't know anyone there except one person who was also there, who was also in Peru. So I was wandering alone a lot. I talked to a lot of random people. I made friends with a lot of random shopkeepers and people in temples. I would just have conversations with anyone who spoke to me. I took a lot of selfies with people because, as you know, if you're a Westerner in India, you will get asked to take selfies with people all the time. It's very strange. Anyway, one morning I ran into this group of kind of ragtag type dudes. They were, I don't know if they were wandering sadhus, which is the name for spiritual seekers, but they, I would talk to them a lot whenever I would pass by, and they were really funny. They were very wild. They were very friendly. And so we would just chat on the street and they would tell me stories. And then one of the guys who reminded me actually of the rapper from Wu-Tang, I don't know if everyone remembers, there's a rapper called Old Dirty Bastard. He was like an Indian version of him, just almost seemed like he was on acid or something. And he would get so overly excited sometimes when talking. He would calm himself down doing pranayamas and breathing practices. So I found that to be kind of hilarious, just how much these spiritual practices are integrated into the culture there. So one late afternoon, they were smoking hash, which they offered it to me and I took. And then shortly after, I said goodbye and I went to the ashram to do my daily meditation. And when I arrived at the ashram, I was about to enter the guru's room, but I was filled with just this overwhelming, heavy guilt because I disrupted my spiritual practice by smoking with them. I believe there was also a rule at the ashram against this. And I just felt so terrible. I wouldn't even enter the ashram into this guru's room. And I just decided to sit outside of it instead. And then interestingly, when I was about to enter the door, I also felt very strongly an energy, which in retrospect, I think was an elemental being that protects the ashram. So for those who are familiar with Rudolf Steiner's cosmology, many spiritual teachings talk about this, not just him, but there's elemental beings of each place in nature, each physical place. So I felt some sort of being telling me not to come in. And I sat outside. And then I had headphones in and I was listening to the Gayatri mantra and I was singing along with it, almost hoping that chanting the mantra itself would cleanse me of my guilt and shame, which, by the way, they do say that Gayatri mantra is an amazing karmic cleanser. So I wasn't wrong with that, but I was almost doing it with the wrong intention. And then suddenly something hit me, which I could only describe as the energy of the guru enter my field. He seemed to be responding very positively to the mantra that I was singing. And then just suddenly something hit me, which is an outpouring of love beyond anything I had ever experienced. It was kind of there was a channel of light which opened up from the heavens and just descended upon me quite suddenly. And, one of the first things I realized is that this guilt and shame I had been holding on to my whole life, that I had been in the state of right before this happened, this guilt and shame was really filtering my perception of myself and the world. It was making me walk around in a trance state. And I realized that this guilt and shame was all a figment of my imagination and how loved I truly was. So it felt like what I could only describe as being instantly forgiven for anything I ever thought was wrong with me. It was a love beyond anything I even knew was possible. I just basically realized how loved I truly was. And I was just sobbing uncontrollably. I don't think I've ever sobbed so hard in my life. So much later on, I realized I had been hit by divine grace, and it came to me in the moment when I least expected it, when I felt the most unworthy, the most guilty, the most shameful. It had nothing to do with what I thought I was doing, how good my meditation was doing, how pure I thought I was. And that moment, even though I didn't realize it at the time, did change my relationship to God, to life, to myself, to everything, because I just had this direct experience of this love that all the great saints and sages talk about how God is unconditionally loving. And I didn't speak about what happened to anyone until months later, because it took me a really long time to even process that, to see what happened. I feel like in moments like this, it's not like I was like suddenly enlightened, unfortunately, unless I'm missing something, but like my entire relationship to myself, to God, to reality changed. And I think within the main thing I realized is because within all religious and spiritual traditions, there's often emphasis on purity. You do certain practices, you meditate in a certain way, you abstain from certain things, and I do think they have their time and place. We need to purify our wounds. We need to purify the blockages within our body that's in the way of us receiving God, but what I also learned in that moment is that there's a will of God, a grace of God that overrides everything. And if we focus on maintaining what we think is purity, because we feel fundamentally shameful or unworthy, it then becomes this form of masochism. And we're almost engaging in all these practices from a point of view of we're not good enough, of we're just these like terrible people, which is, as I said, is like a filter, which will affect everything and every way that you see the world. It actually blocks you from even seeing the beauty in nature, the beauty in yourself, the beauty in other people, and it also blocks the love of God. So ultimately, this divine grace overrides everything. It overrides our errors, our mistakes, what we think is impure. We don't need to earn it. And it, like I shared with my experience, it can hit you when you least expect it. It can hit you when you feel the least worthy, and that is really true unconditional love. Okay, so let's talk about, we're going to touch on Adyashanti's experience and kind of tie this in, and we'll share some experiences of other spiritual teachers. So I think Adyashanti shares about this on Healing the Core Wound of Unworthiness, which is an audiobook. So if you want to listen to this in his own words, I recommend listening to it. But to summarize, basically Adyashanti was on silent retreat. Adyashanti was overwhelmed on this retreat by an indescribable energy, something very uncomfortable. And, he tried to endure it for a period, but then he eventually broke and he just felt defeated and he left the retreat secretly. And he believed basically in that moment he had failed in his spiritual quest. And then when he arrived home, a quiet inner voice told him to go directly into meditation. And he had this meditation hut in his backyard. And so he obeyed this voice and he sat, in meditation in his backyard. And this is when an overwhelming grace descended, which felt like a boundless love that flooded his entire being. And in that moment, he heard a clear inner voice saying, "This is how I love you, and this is how you shall love all things." So this was almost like, not just a personal experience of awakening, but a commandment that he was meant to live and love other people with that same redemptive, unconditional love that he had just received. So it was both healing for him. It both helped spiritually inspire him. It was a call for him to embody that love in the world. And then the next day, his teacher invited him back to the retreat. And when he returned, a senior student told him, "You shouldn't have left and you shouldn't have come back." But by this time, this experience of infinite love he experienced was still there. He couldn't shake it. And it really showed him that this redemptive love is just independent of external conditions. And, in this moment, he felt this grace basically cleansed him from within, from a lot of the shame, the judgment, the resistance that he was experiencing. And he realized that this was not just a love for him personally, but was part of the essential nature of all beings. And his path was to embody and share it. And in Adyashanti's words, he basically said, "When redemptive love blossoms within you, it's as if everything is suddenly made right. The beauty of existence starts to shine forth. Redemptive love is an act of grace. We cannot make it happen. Redemptive love can only be experienced when the ego has completely relinquished resisting its own suffering or the suffering of others. Redemptive love knows that there is nothing to cleanse, there is nothing to forgive, because everything is forgiven from the beginning. It knows that everything is made whole by seeing it always was and is whole. It's not about replacing bad stories with good stories. Redemptive love cleanses you of those stories. It allows you to start perceive life as it actually is, to perceive life through the eyes of eternity, which is exactly what I experienced. Is like this whole idea. It's not like I experience this love and like all of a sudden like, oh, I'm a good person and I'm enlightened and I'm holy or whatever. It cleansed me of just seeing through all of those stories of I'm good, I'm bad, I've done wrong, I've done right, and to realize that, there's nothing to cleanse. There's nothing to forgive. We are only caught up in these illusions that we're impure and we've done something wrong. And that's actually not how God sees us and how God loves us.
Yeah, these are some very powerful stories. Thank you for sharing yours, and really relates to Adyashanti's story as well. Now, I want to go over some other historical examples. There are many other powerful stories. I just want to summarize them briefly, of individuals who really lived in darkness, engaged in evil deeds, right? Violence even, but were radically transformed by the direct experience of the grace, divine grace. So again, as Laura mentioned, these stories will illustrate that grace is not earned by virtue or even religious practice alone, but can descend suddenly, often also in moments of despair, surrender, or spiritual crisis, just in the case of Laura and Adyashanti. And to set the stage, I want to quote Sri Aurobindo here from Letters on Yoga. He says, quote, I should like to say something about the divine grace. He's responding to a sadhak, to a disciple asking about the divine grace. I should like to say something about the divine grace, for you seem to think it should be something like a divine reason acting upon lines not very different from those of human intelligence. But that is not so. Also, it is not a universal divine compassion either, acting impartially on all who approach it and acceding to all prayers, answering to all prayers. It does not select the righteous, nor rejected the sinner. The divine grace came to the aid of Saul of Tarsus. It came to Saint Augustine, the profligate, to Jagai and Madal of infamous fame, to Bilwa Mangal, and many others whose conversion might well scandalize the puritanism of the human moral intelligence. But it can come to the righteous also, curing them of their self-righteousness and leading to a purer consciousness beyond these things. It is a power that is superior to any rule, even to the cosmic law, for all spiritual seers have distinguished between the law and grace. Yet it is not indiscriminate. Only it has a discrimination of its own, which sees things and persons and the right times and seasons with another vision than that of the mind or any other normal power. So I want to share some of these stories which Sri Aurobindo mentioned in this quote. So a great example is what he talked about Saul of Tarsus. And the background here is that Saul was a very fierce persecutor of early Christians, very complicit in their imprisonment and executions, even killing Christians. But on the road to Damascus, he experienced a blinding vision of Christ. And this mystical encounter knocked him off his horse and left him actually blind for 3 days. And as a result, after this radical intervention, he became one of the most devoted apostles of Christ, spreading the gospel across the Roman Empire, and also his work made up a significant part of the New Testament. So out of Saul of Tarsus, he became Saint Paul. So he didn't see Christ, right? Christ came to him basically in this act of the grace and not based on merit. Another interesting story also from the Christian tradition is Saint Augustine. So Augustine actually lived a life full of indulgence, lust, and worldly ambition, and he famously said, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. And he also had a turning point there. He heard a childlike voice telling him, it's Latin tolle lege, which stands for take and read. So obeying this voice, Augustine opened the Bible at random, and his eyes fell on Romans 13, which says, let us walk properly, as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desire. So, interestingly, synchronistically, this verse directly addressed the very lifestyle he had been living. And he wrote then later in his book Confessions, after he heard that voice, and reading that excerpt from the Bible, he said, I arose, interpreting it no otherwise than as a command from God to open the book and read the first chapter. I had no wish to read more and no need to do so, for instantly as I came to the end of the sentence, it was as though the light of confidence flooded into my heart and all the darkness of doubt was dispelled. So as a result, he renounced his former life and became a bishop, a philosopher, and one of Christianity's most influential theologians as well. So another example of the grace, of the divine grace. Another very popular example is John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace after he received the grace. Now, many people maybe don't know that John Newton, he was a captain in a transatlantic slave trade, right? He was known for his cruelty, blasphemy, and moral depravity. And by his own admission, he called himself a wretch living in spiritual darkness. But in 1748, caught in a very violent storm at sea, he cried out to God for mercy. And miraculously, the ship, and he survived the moment of desperation, marked the beginning of his awakening act of pure grace. And in this case, the change was gradual, but he recognized the divine intervention, saving him from the storm. And he eventually left the slave trade. He became a Christian minister and dedicated his life to spiritual service. And famously, in 1772, he wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, right? His personal testimony of redemption. He also became a leading voice in the British abolition movement. Now, another example is very interesting, which Sri Aurobindo talked about, is Bill Mangal from Lust to Divine Love. Bill Mangal was a wealthy Brahmin scholar consumed by lust for a courtesan woman named Chintamani, and his obsession drove him to extremes, even once famously crossing a river using a corpse and snake just to see her, to engage sexually with her. And the turning point was when that woman finally said to him, if only you had this much devotion for God, you would attain liberation. And her words really pierced him. In that moment, grace struck. He renounced everything and went to Vrindavan to see Krishna. He became a saint poet composing the Krishna Karnamrita and is now revered in the Bhakti tradition for his deep devotion and divine longing. So another example of this divine grace. Another one I want to touch upon, very interesting, Saint Mary of Egypt. She lived in the early 4th century and in Egypt, actually in Alexandria, lived a life of extreme sexual excess and hedonism, driven by pleasure with no spiritual concern. And she was visiting Jerusalem with a group of people and tried to enter the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but was mysteriously actually blocked by an unseen force. Kind of reminds me what you shared about. She was not able to enter that church, right? Shocked and open and broken open, she prayed for mercy before the Virgin Mary and promised to change her life. And as a result, she spent the next 47 years in the desert, became a desert saint, repented, and experienced the grace as well. So there was a big changing point in her life as well, when the grace revealed her truth and she responded with total devotion. So you can see certain aspects of grace, certain aspects that hit immediately, right, change, or served as a divine inspiration, then gradually transformed the lives of these people. So again, we need to understand that grace operates beyond the law, beyond karma or merit. By the way, merit in spiritual or religious context refers to accumulated value of good actions, virtues, or spiritual progress, right? That supposedly earns your favor or blessing or advancement, right? But again, God and the grace work beyond reward or punishment, right? A response to a moment of sincerity, this grace, of openness or shock that breaks the grip of the ego. That's really what it comes down to. And the soul, even buried under lifetimes of ignorance, can still respond when this flame is lit.
And I think in retrospect, that the grace that I experienced did follow a period of unseen preparation, even though It seemed like it appeared suddenly. It was preceded by my own spiritual practice, by my own inner work. There was almost a certain type of readiness or psychic openness, so that when that grace appeared, I was able to just allow it in. My mind didn't try and interfere or interrupt, which is something that also can happen. And even after that happened, even after the descent of the divine grace, we need to realize that effort is still needed to integrate and sustain what happened. So we can go through these long periods of preparation, of meditating, of doing our spiritual practice. Actually, one of my favorite quotes from Reggie Ray, he says, when you think that nothing is happening, everything is happening. And when you think that something is happening, nothing is happening. So sometimes, I don't know, for anyone who's a serious meditator who engages in a serious spiritual practice, it's like, you will do this for many, many times and it'll be like, nothing's happening. And I think this idea that when you meditate, like the heavens are going to open up and you're going to have these powerful spiritual experience, I think that is actually what's often in the way of us having a spiritual experience. We have to do it for a sincere desire to know God, but then also not expecting anything to happen. But
exactly.
Effort is still needed, and we have to be receptive. So we have to be sincere. We have to be faithful. We have to be patient. If we're entitled or impatient or restless, obviously those can be cured with meditation with time, but that doesn't help. And it tends to block the action of grace. So this effort, the sincerity, the spiritual aspiration are still necessary for most. Even though the grace acts spontaneously, we will experience more subtle forms of grace through our inner sincerity and through our spiritual aspirations, and at the same time, some can receive grace very quickly without much, seeming like they've earned it, but I would also argue there still has to be sincerity to integrate it, because if you receive that grace, like you can actually kind of have a powerful experience and you can kind of lose it. And I would also argue that like Adyashanti talks about this a lot. He talks about abiding and non-abiding awakening. So abiding awakening is when you have an experience of illumination and it stays. It's very rare. The most famous case is Ramana Maharishi, who basically realized the self at 16 and never changed. But there's also non-abiding awakening, which is like we have this experience and it changes us, but then we kind of go back to our baseline. But I would also argue that this experience, a direct experience of God, will forever change your orientation to reality, because especially if you experience that, and I would also argue when you experience that through a meditation practice rather than even, psychedelics can kind of open things up for you, but it's very different when it happens to you when you are like, not in an altered state of consciousness. So, even though the grace can descend quickly, it doesn't respond to what we've earned or doesn't earn. It doesn't negate the value of discipline and inner work. And we have to really trust in the divine will and timing. Even when progress seems slow or it seems that obstacles arise, I notice a lot of people who first get into meditation say, oh, I tried to meditate, but my mind, I just can't still my mind. And the whole thing is that you're learning to meditate because you're learning to train your mind. And the stillness will come as a result of you learning how to train your mind and not just respond to every thought that pops up and, return to the whatever point of awareness or whatever focus of awareness that your meditation practice is telling you to focus on. So to expect that we're just going to sit in meditation and experience these profound meditative states is not the point. The first thing that you're going to witness in meditation is how insane your mind is. And if you're not witnessing that, then I don't know what's going on. So we need to really realize that this idea of like demanding things or, complaining or blaming or, these kind of temper tantrums we can, give on the spiritual path, it doesn't really help. We have to learn to just face difficulties in our practice with perseverance, faith. Faith was really the main thing that was guiding me throughout this experience, as I trusted in the process of meditation, and I trusted if I kept going that, it would help me with my relationship with God and the spiritual path. So there has to be this sense of faith and not expecting anything to happen, but just doing your practice every single day, chop wood, carry water, just do it. Don't expect anything to happen. And, you know, you never know when it will hit you. It can hit you out of nowhere. It can hit you in a subtle way. It can hit you in a very intense way. You never know. So kind of going back to my experience, as I shared, when I went to this Vipassana retreat and then I experienced this quieting in the mind, this was the first sign of grace. Although I didn't realize it, it was very subtle. It was like this peacefulness, you know, this presence. It wasn't this dramatic moment that happened later. And so I've noticed that these moments of just sudden peace, you know, suddenly everything that you were worried about just seems to melt away, and you're just there in the moment, and you have this, you may not have a profound realization about reality, but you just feel a sense of presence. Those moments are actually preparing your soul over time for these deeper transformations. So, you know, and the mother has a very good quote, you know, she's talking about the first signs of grace. She says, it may come as a pressure, a whisper, a touch, a presence, and then it withdraws and the preparation continues. So as you see, like I had this experience after meditation retreat, this quieting of the mind, it just kind of went away. I just carried on with my life. I just continued my practice, you know. So we need to have this sense of perseverance, to not give up, to have this faith and trust, you know, that if you keep going on the path, you know, sometimes it's also the case that you think that nothing is happening and you think that nothing has changed in your life. But then you look to like 5-10 years ago and you're like, wow, my life has radically changed. Who I am has radically changed. But you don't notice it because you're living in your body every single day. You don't notice these subtle changes. It's like if you changed like a hair on your head every single day, you wouldn't notice. Eventually your hair would look entirely different. So we have to also realize that we don't actually realize how profoundly we're being changed until we look at things in retrospect. So yeah, just to wrap up the end of the podcast, we're going to continue on in the second hour. In the second hour, we're going to begin by talking about types of grace. So there's sudden grace, fierce grace, there's gentle grace, sustaining grace, awe-inspiring grace. And then we're also going to talk about divine guidance. So you can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, the second part, we talk more about divine guidance, which is more the quiet ongoing current, really, that moves through our lives, kind of like with divine will. It still operates within karma, but supports you to learn your own lesson, right? Again, unlike grace, which comes like a lightning, guidance unfolds more through the rhythms of daily life, through synchronicities, inner nudges, and so forth. So we show you how to recognize this divine guidance in your everyday life. Most importantly, help you in practical ways how to tune to it more deeply, and how it really works to lead you towards a great alignment of truth. And it's really about cultivating the inner conditions through which guidance and maybe even grace can move more clearly, so we can also recognize it better, the divine guidance in our daily lives. And this is for members only. If you're a member not yet, go to my website, veilofreality.com/membership. And you can sign up there and you'll have access to over 160 episodes, the second hours, where we give many more insights, more information, most importantly, a lot of practical guidance for all kinds of psycho-spiritual topics. And with that being said, we'll be right back. Thank you for listening.